and welcome to my channel of 30 Books, where I talk about Australian books and Australian writers to get you to run out and buy or borrow and read and talk about an Australian book. Now, speaking of Australian writers, I have the Australian Children's Laureate. And run me, Sally Rippon. You are the most famous person I have had on 30 Books. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. Yes, but we go back a long way.
We do.
When you were at Writers Vic, and I had a little studio in there, and I was just starting out pretty much. So I illustrated a few books, but I was just starting out working with Heidi Grant, who have gone on to be my publishers. So that would be, I'd say, at least 12 to
17 years ago.
17, right.
Yeah,
okay.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
Now, and since then, Sally, you have gone on to be, I think, the Australia's most probably prolific and famous writer.
Well, this is all very high praise. I feel like I should
Well,
be
it's not
wearing
praise.
like
I think
cape
it's,
or a
yeah.
crown or something like
Well, I
that.
was going to say, what does it take to become a laureate? And what does it mean? As in, so what does laureate stand for a start?
Okay, well, the kind of a trick question in the sense that, so laureates exist among all categories and all around the world. So you may have heard of a poet laureate. I think that's quite a big deal over in the UK. People are very familiar with laureates. It's a relatively new thing here. So about 17 years ago, Alison Lester and Buri Pryor were our first Australian Children's Laureates. And every laureate gets to bring their own passion or their own mission to their time. So I've got 2 years being the laureate. And for me, I am very passionate about supporting kids who may struggle with conventional education or learning to read, as did my youngest son. So my mission is all kids can be readers. And the idea being is that I'll be traveling around the country, talking with lots of kids, which a lot of children's authors do, but also hopefully talking with teachers, parents, and change makers about how we can create supportive systems so that all children of all learning capacities can thrive.
We'll get on to that. We'll talk a little bit more about how that has shaped your writing, like the experience of that. But let's go right back to the beginning, and I think we're going to talk about this. There's a young woman, her name is Billy B. Brown, and she kicked it all off.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about Billy, for the two people out there who aren't familiar with her.
Well, Billy came along and bought me the time to be just a writer. So what I mean by that is I had actually been writing for a long time before Billy and had many, many books published. But like a lot of people in the creative industries, it's very hard to make a living from what you do. So I think I probably had, let's say, 30 books published before Billy B. Brown.
Oh, I do apologise for that, because I thought maybe 5 or 6.
Nobody knows about
What were you publishing before then? You were doing a lot of illustration.
Well, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So I started out mainly as an illustrator, actually. In fact, the first books I had published in 1996, I wrote and illustrated, and they were called Speak Chinese Fang Fang and Fang Fang's Chinese New Year. So they were picture books based on the experience of me working with Chinese Australian kids, tutoring them in English as a second language, but also having grown up in Southeast Asia myself and feeling that discord that you can often feel with your culture at home and then in your outside life. So that's essentially what those books were about. But one of them won an Illustrators Award, which then meant that I was asked to illustrate for a lot of other writers, including some very famous ones like John Marsden and Margaret Wilde. And the great thing that came out of that is it gave me a lot of connections with lots of different publishing houses. So I say all of that because by the time I came to write Billy, I was 39 years old, a single mum, and I couldn't make a living from writing books, and I was very ready to give up. And so I know, right? So
people need to hear this.
That's why I think it's really important to say, because people do often only know the book that someone's become famous by. They don't know all the books that came before. My dog.
And this is what also Liz Gilbert has talked about,
right.
Because everyone thinks that Eat, Pray, Love was the first one, but she had been writing for many, many years prior to that.
Yeah, and many great books as well. I read some of the earlier ones, and it's really important to recognise that is part of what makes you a writer, is all the books that you write and all the books that you write that will never get published as well. And so I had got to 39. I was teaching professional writing for children at RMIT and thinking, all right, I just need to go and teach full time. I can't make a living from writing. And I met this fantastic publisher, Hilary, who worked at Heidi Grant at the time. And she said, I want to create a series about a really strong female character. Do you want to write for the series or do you want to write the series? And they had become very successful in writing very commercial series, so Zack Power and Go Girls, and done very well with that. And so I said, I want to write the series. And so she said, all right, go away and come up with some ideas. And I wrote down 6 storylines about a little girl called Billy B. Brown. And they loved them. And it's really important also to say, because you can take a lot of credit as a writer, but it was a whole team of people that helped this series take off, because they're slim little books, as you can see, very easily lost on a bookshelf. So there was a whole team of people at Heidi Grant Children's Publishing at the time who put in a lot of effort in marketing, and we had another illustrator on board. Often I illustrated, but this illustrator, Aki Fukuoka, was working very hard for us to get a lot of books published in a short space of time. It was actually 53 books over 3 years between Billy and later Jack. And so I guess all of this to say that that was the overnight success. That everybody looks at that and thinks, oh wow, she has written Billy B. Brown, and that was it. But there were many books before, and then there was this period of time where we were just writing so many books to try to create an impact, to have the books out there for people to notice. And they hit a sweet spot. There wasn't anything at that time featuring strong female characters for girls of this age. A lot of fairies and princesses. So everything came together at the right time. And they just took off, and they have been they've given me a whole new lease of life as a writer, because I still am as busy, but I'm getting to make the choices more of how I spend that time.
So tell us what sort of girl. We say she's a strong girl, but what does that mean?
A strong female character. But I think particularly when I first started out writing Billy, I associated that with doing things that are very gender stereotyped. And so as a girl growing up, I didn't really like wearing dresses much. I climbed trees. I did things that people think of as being boyish. And we used to call that tomboy. And so that's the character that I created. I wanted her to be strong, and I wanted her to not really be concerned with frills and so forth. But the illustrator, Aki Fukuoka, who I hadn't met before, she loves to dress up.
Yeah.
So when she started designing the Billy character, she would just put these incredible outfits on her. And it really made me thinking about how much we associate feminist girls with not being girly. I think this is changing now, but certainly 15 years ago when I was writing this, it was like you had to be, very masculine in the sense to show you were strong. But you can also rock a frilly dress and still be a fierce feminist as well.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to show with what Billy can be. You can be girly and strong. And her best friend Jack is very sensitive and very emotional. So he's like the counteract to all the very, the heroes and the action heroes and the that kind of very stereotypical boy character. So we're really playing with gender stereotypes, but also not stereotyping ourselves within stereotypes.
You have travelled quite a bit as a children's writer, and I've seen your social media accounts at times when you've been in America, and the posters and the letters and the love that you receive from children. And I always think there is no greater compliment than the adoration of a child who's not yours. How does that make you feel? Look, my hairs are standing on end just talking about it. How does that make you feel to be such a fan base of children?
It's amazing. And look, kids don't hold back. Both
ways. Okay.
Both ways. So if you go into a school to talk to a whole lot of kids, you're going to know really quickly if they're bored. They're not going to put a polite face on you. So it works both ways. And so when a child is effusive about how they feel or how they connect with your books, it's incredible, and it's a beautiful experience. And even more so what's happening, because the first book was published, I think we're coming up to 15 years next year. So now I'm meeting teenagers who are saying, oh, Billy B. Brown, they were the books I learned to read on. And when I used to teach writing for children at RMIT, these are the books that people have this emotional connection to, the books of our childhoods, the book that grandma read to me, or the first one you learned to read on, or the one where, you worked out that spiders might have feelings, as in Charlotte's Web. And so often when you hold up a book from someone's childhood, it does bring back this incredible visceral reaction to it. And so to think that I could be that for somebody and be the person that they look at a book when they've grown up and think, that takes me right back to childhood, that does it for me as well, I have to say.
And speaking of which, what were the books that you grew up with, and also the book that resonates with you?
If I had to choose one book, it would probably be that one. And I think because that epitomizes what good writing does, is that it forces you to imagine the world from someone else's perspective. And in this case, that of an animal. And it hadn't occurred to me as a child that you look at these creepy crawly 8-legged things and think that they have their own reason to be in the world in the way that E.B. White did so beautifully in this. And also just showing that connection that Fern, the main character, had with the creatures, her defiant up for what she believed in. And later on, which maybe we'll touch on later if we get the chance, I talk about how often we celebrate children in literature who are defiant, who stand up against authority, who are rebels, but we don't like these children in real life. We like real life children to be very quiet and sit down and listen. So I think there's also something that children relate to or can connect to or feel vicariously excited by reading about somebody who is going out in the world and doing brave things. Because often children's authors know to get the adults out of the picture as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Roald Dahl was the king of that. You know, kill them off, the aunts, the nasty aunts on page 1 and let the kids have the adventure.
Yeah.
So there's something about entering that child's world with the adults just at the periphery that I think is really incredibly freeing.
So these books here, therefore,
Yes.
what age group are we talking about for the Billy B. Brown?
So to give you another little bit of background to the Billy stories, so these I began to write when my youngest son was in grade 3, and he plateaued at his reading level and started saying things no parent wants to hear, let alone a parent who's a children's author, like, I hate books and I hate reading. And I had an inkling of what dyslexia was, but not really a deep understanding. And so my solution to it was just write a series he'd want to read. And so I used the language of a school reader, and you can see if you look at the text, it's very simple vocabulary, very simple layout. Only 2 consonant, words with 2 consonants and very simple sentences. So I really worked in keeping it almost like a reader, but with a proper story arc, proper character development. So it would give a child an incentive to read and a sense of accomplishment. They'd read a proper chapter book. Readers are pretty dull. So that's what this was to do, was to create a series that my son would want to read. And, there are a whole lot of other problems that come with being neurodivergent that I discovered much later. Not problems, but the need for different supports that a non-neurodivergent child would need, and I had to learn a lot of that along the way. But this was my first attempt at doing something that he could read. But since writing the Billy books, I came across a lot of parents that would say even the Billy books can be a bit of a stretch for a very, very early reader. And so the next thing that I went on to do was just look at the most basic way that we teach reading, which is really looking at it as a code. So breaking it down to the most simple sounds and the most simple words. And this is something children will be taught at school. So what I'm creating here for them is not...
But these books are they in the school curriculum?
Not
yet.
But get back to me like that in heaven. But more what I was doing is I was setting up rhymes where these are a word that a child could stand up for themselves. Hug. And this is the kind of teaching that they'll be having at school. So this isn't a school reader. It's like the bridge between a school reader and a chapter book. So the idea being that they're kind of fun and kooky, but secretly educational as well.
Oh, you snuck that in. It's like sneaking vegetables in, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you'd start by reading it to a child, then some of the words they recognize for themselves, and eventually they're reading it on their own. And so the trick with having a child learn to read is that often the early stages are boring. They really just have to see it like a code, often do quite just very instructional readers. Like if you're sitting down to play the piano, you might need to learn scales, and that doesn't feel like you're playing music in the beginning. But the idea being that eventually you'll get to a place where you can play enough music and it sounds great. And reading is the same. Those early years of teaching reading is just about showing kids it's a code that needs to be broken down. So the idea being that if you share a book like this with their child at home, they can see how those early codes are put into place and give them the incentive to want to do the rest for themselves. So that's
that you're talking about writing children's books. It's there's so much to it.
Mm.
Like, is this something most children's writers have an awareness, or is it because of your experience of having a son who has dyslexia?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think as there is for adults, there's all kinds of books for all kinds of kids. And I was a very good reader. And so I was reading Charlotte's Web, when I was very young. And I learned to read, I think, even before I started school.
Oh, okay.
And this will happen for some children.
Yeah.
They'll pick up reading by osmosis. Others will need more support to really get those skills embedded. And so when I first started out as a writer, I was writing the kind of books that I would have liked to read. And these are great fun books to write because you can really play with language and you can play with imagery and you can go into quite complex themes. But what I really set myself the challenge to do as a writer, and we all have our own kind of parameters that we work within, is how to engage our most struggling reader. Still creating books with story arcs and imagination and sometimes underlying themes too, but in really accessible language so that not only a child learning to read, but potentially who may have reading difficulties, but let's say even a child with English as a second language,
Yes.
or an older child who's fallen through the gaps and potentially not picked up the skills they need. They might be grade 5 or 6, but they may not feel too embarrassed to read something like that. It doesn't look too daggy, it doesn't look too much like an educational reader. So I'm trying to catch the kids that fall through the gaps. And I think because I saw that happen for my son, and I saw how that not only affected his ability to engage with school, but later his mental health and his capacity to express himself, because we use language for everything. And so dyslexia is not only going to be a hurdle to overcome in schoolwork, but even how you are as a person in the world. This is the one that I wrote that I needed when my son first started school. So this is my first book for grown-ups, Stella.
Wild Things, how we learn to read and what can happen if we don't.
Yeah, so what happened is that as my son got to high school, that's when the wheels really fell off. Because when a child's in primary school, they're often just with one teacher who can see their best and take them under their wings and make sure that they're doing okay. Once you get to high school, you've got all these different teachers. You've got maybe 45 minutes in a class. He couldn't even find out where the classroom was, let alone actually engaging with the work that was in the classroom. So he went downhill very, very quickly. And later he was identified as also having ADHD. And it's often quite common that when there's one neurodivergency that presents, that there'll be overlapping ones as well.
And they're often contradictory of what we think each one is.
Exactly.
And ADHD is not what we think it is.
Well, this was a steep learning curve for me,
Yes.
because when this was first identified, I went into all this kind of panic that I had recognized. I had all these preconceived ideas of what it was, that I was a bad mother. I'd been giving him, I had all these ideas.
Red cordial.
Red cordial,
Yeah.
that's right. And he wasn't a ratty kid either. He was more of the daydreaming, jokey type. And this is why, and you probably notice this as well, a lot of women now are recognizing themselves as having ADHD, because it can transform into it can present in so many ways, but we often pick it up earlier in boys because it's often an external way of presenting. So it can often be more the hyperactive style, whereas girls can be more the daydreaming style. And also girls are very much conditioned to be good. And so often girls will internalize shame, and potentially that it might come out in self-harming, whereas boys will often make really bad choices. And so this was the track my son was going down, just doing some really dumb things. And so all the alarm bells were going off. We did trial him on medication for a while, which was life-changing. So he went from grade 4 maths level in year 9 to year 10 being top of his statistics.
Oh my
class.
goodness.
Yeah, I know, within
Yeah.
the space of taking I think it was a term on medication.
Yeah.
He chooses not to take it because there are side effects that he doesn't like. But what that little window did is let him recognize that he is really bright. He started to teach himself astrophysics, university level calculus, but he couldn't pass school because he couldn't write an essay on Shakespeare. Yeah. And so this was just such a steep learning curve for me, who'd always found learning easy, and his 2 older brothers too. And I thought, why didn't I know all this before? And how's all this information out there, but it's so inaccessible, books on neuroscience and books on literacy. So I just asked a lot of questions and I put it all exactly. Yeah.
And also just to say, if you have ADHD, you don't have to be brilliant. because there's this kind of thing like, well, yeah.
You all end up being entrepreneurs and artists and so forth. And this is really important too, because I made the mistake, like a lot of well-meaning parents do for my son, in thinking, all right, so he's dyslexic and he has ADHD, so he's going to present him with some challenges. Let's show him all these incredible role models who are these success stories.
No pressure.
That's right. And it's like, could I just be me? And, you know, could I be... The labels, a lot of people say, should we label our kids? Now, we think of it more as an identification.
Yes, yeah.
Because if I sent my son to school and I didn't tell any of his teachers he was left-handed and they were all forcing him to use his right hand, he's not going to be able to achieve his potential. So for me, it's really useful background information for parents to pass on to teachers, but it doesn't need to completely pigeonhole who somebody is. It's information about some of the things that they may have strengths in, some of the areas they have strengths in, but also some they may need extra support.
Beautiful. Now, we were talking about how that has influenced your writing, and you have a rather beautiful picture book here, hardcover, Come Over to My House. Tell us about Come Over to My, by Eliza Hull and Sally Rippon, with Daniel Gray Barnett. So was Daniel the illustrator?
Yeah.
And Eliza Hull, she's a musician as well. Yes.
Yeah. Eliza is amazing. So she's a close friend of mine, and we've known each other for quite a long time. She lives up in Castlemaine. I had a place up there for a while. And we often talked about how she never saw herself represented in books growing up. And she lives with a disability called I'm not going to say it properly, Marie Charcot-Tooth, named after the three people who identified their disability. And as a child, required a wheelchair for quite a lot of her childhood. And was just talking about how sometimes the only books you can find for children that live with disabilities are ones where that's what the story is about. You know, little Marie uses a wheelchair, this is how she gets around. But we wanted to create a story that just introduces us to all these interesting, fun family households who have adapted with their disabilities to in really creative ways. And every single family in this book is based on families that Eliza knows. And so everything was very authentic and very much, and they all got to see themselves represented in here. So we have all kinds of families represented in here, rainbow families, people living with all kinds of disabilities. And I don't know if you remember that book in the 70s, Come Over to My House, and it was one of my favorites. And it was visiting people in all different cultures. And I remember as a child, because we traveled a lot, you'd go and stay with a family in Japan, you'd stay with an Eskimo house in an igloo and all of that. And I used to read it again and again. So really, this is what that is. It's you visit each house, they show you around, you have a great time. And isn't that interesting that this mum reads in Braille, or this father uses a special claw so that he can reach things up high, or this person, you know, might use a wheelchair to get around so they have a special swing in their backyard. So the disability is part of their lives, but like neurodivergency, it's not their whole identification. It's just things that they have adapted to so that they can live the lives that they want to live. Yeah. So this was written with Eliza, and Eliza, as well as being a wonderful musician, is a disability advocate. And we're working on another book at the moment about the social model of disability, which is a lot what we're talking about now, that there's nothing wrong with the person. The person is perfect. If we can adapt the world to suit the person's specific needs, then they can also thrive.
So let's go. This is an unusual friendship we've got here.
Well, in a sense, this is very much an allegory, and this started out trying to explain to my son how racism exists in the world, because often to a child it's inexplicable. How is it that people are treating each other in this way? And so I didn't want to write a story about a person of colour and a white person. I wanted to make it really clear that this was a case of apartheid. This is a world where witches and monsters don't mix. But these two, who are young and live next door to each other, they're also a little bit outsiders in their own world. So Polly is dyslexic, and so she messes up her spells, and Buster is a feelings monster, so he changes shape and size depending on how he feels. So monsters are supposed to be big and strong and not afraid of anything. And Polly gets ostracized in class because she messes up her spells. So these two are best friends. And their adventure, or their journey, is to try to create a world where everybody can be friends with anybody, which is the simplest way of, I guess, explaining apartheid to a young child. So what I aim to do is it can be read on several levels. So if you're reading it aloud to a 5 or 6 year old, it would read like a fairy tale story with a little bit of a spooky element. if a grade 6 child was reading it on their own, they could recognise historical cases of how communities and citizens and so forth have become divided just by several seeds being planted and othering who that member of the community might be. So it can be read on lots of levels. And I don't know if you want to have a quick peek at that. I also illustrated it.
Oh.
So all these little black and white illustrations.
Do you miss illustrating?
I do to a point. Let me see if I can find one I particularly like. There's one on the back here, dark one. I do, in a sense that it's a very nice balance to writing. I often find that writing, I'm very caught up in my head, and it's very, there you go, I like that one. I'll hold that one up.
I'll take some pictures
Yes,
later.
that one's on the wall actually, so you can have
Oh.
a picture if you like. But it's a good balance for me. Writing is very cerebral, and I get quite exhausted after a few hours of writing, whereas illustrating, you know, I can often get up in my nightie and start drawing, and I think, why is my tummy hurting? You know, what's wrong? And I'll look up, it'll be 2:00 and I haven't had breakfast, and it's this beautiful flow state that I can get in. So I miss that as much as anything.
Yeah.
But there's something also about illustrating for work that I think has taken a little bit of the joy away for me. I think I like to just keep drawing on the side, because I feel like my style of illustration suits a certain type of book, but for very contemporary books, everybody does them digitally these days, and they're kind of very different styles. So that's not something that I do that much of these days.
When you were talking before, I thought, I think children's books have the capacity to change the world.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm saying something you haven't heard
No,
before.
well, I
Yeah.
guess, you know, children do. I mean,
Yeah,
children,
that's right.
And the other thing that I want to come back to that as the laureate is that, yes, they do, but it's not their responsibility.
No, that's exactly
Yeah.
right.
So
Yeah.
I think this is why it's really important for me that as much as I spend time with children, I'm also talking to adults, because children are only growing up in the world that we've created. So if we're not creating a world where children can thrive, they're not going to be able to be a generation that can make differences. And we talk a lot about climate anxiety in young children too, and I feel like we've almost gone too far in bombarding our children with that information, that there are children who have genuine, there are psychologists and psychiatrists now who specifically deal with climate anxiety. And I think that's a bit too much. You know, there is a moment in your life you can be a little bit protected from all of that. And I feel some ways now with the internet and the 24/7 news, children don't get that protection as much as I would like them to have.
Oh, that's. I was going to ask about what sort of changes that you've seen, especially around writing and with children and what they're concerned about. But yeah, I think you.
Yeah, well, I think children are very savvy, and I think, you know, but children are also very porous and still forming, and I think they do pick up on the mood of what's going on in whether it's the family home or the world. And I think we've also got to recognise that, particularly in places that had really extended lockdowns, there's a lot of repairing we need to do for these children who are disconnected from their peers, often sometimes isolated from whole, you know, normal kind of growth milestones that they should have been. I've got a lot of friends who are primary school teachers and saying, you know, these children coming out of lockdowns, they don't know how to sit down or put their hands up, and a lot of that social development has really been skipped. And for teenagers, you know, missing being able to leave school and, you know, travel around the world, all of those really important milestones. And I think we need to be very focused on big picture stuff, but we also need to be noticing what children need and their support right here and now as well.
Time for some salad spinner, or the salad spinner of fear. Don't be afraid, Sally.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
With your hands. All right.
Pick a question.
Mm-hmm.
What have we got here?
Let's have a look. A book you wish you'd written. Oh, that's easy.
Oh, is it? Oh, you're going to say Charlotte's Web, aren't you?
Okay,
No.
well, I could say Charlotte's Web, but also To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh,
it's pretty
yeah,
amazing, because
yeah.
I love one type of adult book that I really love is when you explore the dark adult world through the perspective of a child, which this is done so beautifully. There's an Italian book called by Niccolo Amaniti called I'm Not Scared that does the same thing. Do you know it?
There was a movie.
Yeah, and it was also made into
Yeah.
a movie. So books that do that, Sophie Laguna does it a lot as well. So when you It's a book for adults, told through the eyes of a child, often within, sometimes even a child language, like Roddy Doyle does that, Paddy Clark, ha ha ha. They're the kind of books that I find just thrilling, in that you're seeing the world from this very distorted perspective of a child, and at the same time just worrying so much for that child. Boy, that movie I watched again the other night, same thing, these beautiful innocent children in this really messed up adult world.
I recently read The Bee Sting, and there's two children, especially PJ in that. Yeah, and is there a danger in that type of thing that children's innocence might be exploited? Like, you have to be quite careful that you're not mocking the child.
Well, none of these films are for children, I think. And it's interesting because during lockdown, when everyone was learning to bake sourdough, I went to study counselling. So I did a semester of an online course, and then after that did a couple of years of Gestalt psychotherapy with the intention of working with...
I made pom-poms during lockdown.
Well, the reason being is this was, my son was at his peak, the peak difficult period. Like, his mental health was a mess by then, and I wanted to know how to better support him. And it was me and him alone in lockdown. No teenage boy would choose to spend that much time voluntarily with his son. So it was a little bit like enforced jail with mum. So I figured I may as well try and do some work to support him. But I went into studying psychotherapy thinking I wanted to work with kids, because I would seen how much my son could have benefited from support earlier on. And I thought, okay, well, that's not wasted if I can do this for other people. And what occurred to me as I was studying is that the kids are fine. I come back to that again and again. It's the child within ourselves that we need to address. And so when you're watching films like that or reading books like that, what you're addressing is the child within yourself that was never given that attention that it needed. And so if we all dealt with our own childhood selves and kind of did the work, then, you know, in a sense, we would be better supporting these kids as we bring them up. And so it really was such a changing of thinking of me, is that I don't need to fix the kids. The kids are perfectly fine. We need to fix the world that they're growing up in.
Oh, absolutely. Let's do another one.
What's Stella's middle name?
No.
Do you think older books should be updated or rewritten?
So we're talking about Roald Dahl, who I actually don't have an opinion. I've never read any Roald Dahl, but there's some other books.
Even Enid Blyton.
Enid Blyton, yeah, and there was like the racism and what's your opinion?
I think it depends on how you share books with children. And I would say, I think it's really good for children to see how we have evolved over time. And we can see that in our literature, you know, in the stuff that was okay, the language that we thought was okay to use now, we're updating all the time. And this is happening in real time, like, because I work quite closely with Eliza in writing this book, come over to my house. She told me about a chapter that she'd written for Carly Finlay's book, Growing Up Disabled in Australia. And she said even in the time from when she'd written her chapter to when it was published, some of the ways of talking about disability had changed. And I think this is the really interesting thing for us all to recognise, is that there will always be changes and evolution in language and thinking and how we see other people, and that's great. And so in a sense, you can almost use this as a lesson to say to kids, look at how people used to talk about people of colour, or look at how people used to, what do you think about that? Or do you think we could do that to make us aware of how far we've come? Having said that, if you were to just keep handing this kind of stuff to a child with no context and you know, no child is only going to be reading one author anyway, maybe there's some problems there. But I do think let's just see this as a sign of how far we've come. And isn't that great? You know, that we are continuing to constantly learn and evolve and recognise other voices and other experiences of being in the world.
Yeah, that's sort of what I think, rather than changing past books, which I'm neither here nor there of. I think, well, let's have different voices, more books.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's more and more opportunity to hear from own voice experiences, not only through literature, which can still be tricky to get a book published, as we both know. You know, that is quite a hurdle to have something that then is published and distributed in the world. We now can access people's stories on social media. So I follow a whole lot of disability advocates, people in the neurodivergent community, and you get to hear their stories in real time. This is their experience of the world. We have access to these stories now, and you know, eventually they may find their ways into books, but not always. But we have no excuse to not learn about what it's like to be someone else now with all that we have.
Has Billy Bean Brown or our little School of Monsters, have they made the screen? The small screen or the big screen?
Billy came very close. So we were actually in a writer's room, and then lockdowns came and that project fell apart. But I am in talks with an Australian animation company about School of Monsters. But watch this space.
And one or two before we head off. And Australian children's writers who are, I mean, obviously you're probably friends with many of them, but have you recommended some Australian, who do you like, or who do you find exciting in the Australian children's writing world?
There are so many. In fact, shall I pull a couple of this card?
Yeah.
So many come to mind, and so many of them are friends. So of course, I would give shout outs to Nova Wheatman and Davina Bell and Jane Godwin and all these beautiful, beautiful writers. But I was lucky enough this year to ask to judge the Victorian Premiers Awards. And this is the first year they've had a children's book category, crazily enough. But this meant that it was 2 years of publications, and this covered picture books right through to middle grade novels, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, self-published. And so it was a really hard decision. So I was with a team of people to decide on the winners. And these are two that I think were real standouts.
It's The Sound of the Thing by Maxine Beneba Clark. Is there anything that she cannot write?
She's pretty amazing. And she illustrates too.
Oh.
So this is really fun.
100 new poems for young people.
Yeah. And I just think there were so many books of poetry I grew up with loving, and I just think it's wonderful that we're still publishing books of poetry for kids. And I just think these are playful, they're thoughtful, they're interesting, and just such an engaging way to play with language with kids. And I think also when we're looking at struggling readers, let's look at other ways of telling stories. It can be graphic novels, poetry, audiobooks.
I struggled with reading when I was a child, and I tell you, we had Mrs. Harvey Roberts. I will never, ever, ever forget her, and I was in her remedial reading class. I learnt a song about a pony and a cart over and over and over again, and that was the key for me.
Yeah.
I didn't have a learning difficulty. I was just a bit... I think I was cripplingly shy.
Yeah. And they often say that sometimes it's just having that one-on-one support.
Yeah.
Like I know my sister's twin boys, when they went into lockdown, they were both behind in reading. Their dad was a teacher. They came out of the lockdowns being ahead of reading. And it was just that one-on-one support, in the classroom. Sometimes there's just too much going on to be able to focus.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just that little bit of extra support. There's, the child is going to learn to read, but the trick is to catch it early on, because the moment they notice the gap between them and their peers, that's when it starts to affect their self-esteem. Then they start telling themselves things like, I can't read, or I'm dumb. So you want to get onto it as quickly as possible. Do you want one more good book?
Yeah.
One more shout out. This was the winner. Ghost Book by Remy Lay, who's Brisbane based, and I am such a fan of comics and graphic novels, and this is the most beautiful, it's just got all the feelings in it, incredibly beautifully illustrated story, so much feeling in it. It's really hard to describe because so much of the emotion is conveyed in the illustrations. Really clever. And for me, when my son got to about grade 5 and 6, all he would read was manga. And that was the only way he could engage with the level of storytelling he wanted, but with really broken down sentences, really short sentences, and he had the pictures for context. So I'm such a fan of comics and graphic novels.
Sally Rippon, prolific Australian children's book writer, a perennial favourite with all the kids, and Australian Children's Laureate. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. It's so nice to see you.